20 years ago, Don Tapscott wrote the groundbreaking book, The Digital Economy. It's always dangerous to predict the future, but Tapscott welcomed the danger. He was right about some things and missed the boat on others, but he chronicles it all in the just-released The Digital Economy, Rethinking Promise and Peril in the Age of Networked Intelligence. And Don Tapscott joins us now. Nice to have you back at TVO.
Great to be here.
Well, before we tackle the book, let's recall that when you wrote the original of this, a lot of the people watching us right now weren't even in this country yet. So I think it's fair enough that we go back and just remind everybody what the general premise of the first book was. It was what?
Well, it was really the first bestseller about the web. And back then, the world was a different place. Google was 5 years later. So you couldn't really search the web. We had these very primitive websites. You accessed it through dial-up, and it took forever for the website to load. Amazon and eBay came out in 1994 in the fall as I was finishing the book. There was no mobile web because there was no mobility. Telephones were connected with wires to walls, or we had these big clunky cell phones. And but the idea was that the internet is not what people think it is. It's not about websites or eyeballs or stickiness or clicks or surfing and all the rest that .coms that people were talking about. It's a new global computational platform, really, that radically drops transaction and collaboration costs. That's what I said. And that this is going to lead to profound disruptive changes in every institution and society. Changes in the way that we kind of get or orchestrate capability, people, resources to do things, to create goods and services, to innovate, to govern ourselves, to travel. And
well, you know, let me jump in there, because you know your critics over the years have said, Don, you're far too bullish about all of this. You think that you think that the future looks a lot better as a result of all of this than a lot of other people do. Are they right about that?
Well, in fairness to me, the subtitle of the book was Promise and Peril in the Age of Networked Intelligence, and I outlined 7 potential problems. And in hindsight, every one of those problems has flourished. So we have a weird situation today where we have this digital revolution that's bringing all these wonders, but you look around, you have massive structural unemployment, you have growing social inequality, the rich getting richer. It's not leveling the playing field as we hoped it might. There's a fragmentation of public discourse where we all end up in these little self-reinforcing echo chambers where the purpose of information is maybe not to inform us, but it's to give us comfort. We've got well, one of the things I warned about is the potential irreversible destruction of our basic right to privacy.
That's
Sadly, I nailed that one. So this is a time of great opportunity still, but it is a time of great peril and danger. We've got a lot to do.
Well, I don't want to seem overly negative about the book, so don't misinterpret this next question. But it's your first line. Your first line in the new book is, not everything I've written holds up well. What in particular do you think doesn't hold up well over the 20 years?
Well, this book pretty much nailed it. The one thing that's quite noticeable in the book that's missing is mobility. But the book was not a futuristic book. It wasn't really a prediction. I talked about ultimately we'll all do this through little mobile devices, but I didn't emphasize that because I was writing a book for people at the time. And but if you look through all of the impacts that I said the web will have, it's all turned out to be true. And some of them have been quite devastating for different industries. And for example, in the book I talked about the impact on the music industry, on the newspaper industry, on broadcasting. I was talking to the head of a big media company recently, and he said the chapter on broadcasting, all my people are still reading that because we're trying to achieve that.
That was prescient.
Today. So, and the industry that I picked to profile was the travel industry, because I said it's going to be one of the first to be hit by this thing I described as disintermediation, that in the digital age, everything in the middle can be eliminated and can go away if you don't create new value. Of course, that's what happened in that industry. You look at all the leaders of the the travel industry today, none of them were around really when I wrote the book.
I'm going to come back to that, but let me ask you a sort of a more overarching question about where we are. Is the digital economy still a capitalist economy?
Well, that's one of the questions I posed in the new edition of the book, and I think it is. I mean, it would sort of be tempting to rename it, given that we have social media and social business and social networks and social marketing and social government and so on.
And so much of it nobody knows how to monetize.
Yeah, but a great word for this new economy might be socialism. Oh, hold it.
Can't use that.
Someone's saying that's already been taken.
Yeah.
Okay, so I described it as capitalism 2.0, and I think that there are some aspects of capitalism that are important. Capitalism has turned out to be the greatest system for innovation. We need markets and we need private ownership of companies. But on the other hand, all the people who talk about we can use all this technology to get rid of government, and it's an argument for a libertarian point of view, I think is wrong, because if anything, we're going to need stronger governments as we move from this industrial age to a whole new networked age, and we need to make some big changes to our society. I think that there are a number of other changes in capitalism 2.0. One of them is that we need to think differently about intellectual property. In the old economy, you owned it, you protected it. Someone tries to infringe your intellectual property, you get out your lawyers. Well, that didn't work so well for the music industry, did it? I mean, they took a legal approach to a business model disruption, and the industry that brought us Elvis and the Beatles is now suing people as its third largest source of revenue, including suing children. So this is terrible, and they're collapsing. The old labels are in deep trouble, and they should be. So we need to start to think differently about intellectual property. For example, right now the pharmaceutical industries are falling off this thing called the patent cliff, where they're losing a quarter of their revenue this year. So what are you going to do? Cut back on paper clips or something? They need to rethink the whole model of research in the industry. They're going to need to place clinical trial data in a commons, sort of create a human genome of clinical trial data, where a rising tide would lift all boats, and they can compete on a different level on packaging and delivery systems and customization and marketing and so on.
But this goes across all sectors. There are so many sectors that have yet to figure out, 20 years after this book, they've yet to figure out how to make a living in the new digital economy that you say is still capitalist, but which, you know, whether it's newspapering or music or whatever, a lot of them haven't figured out how to make a living off the internet. And in fact, they find themselves having to give it away for free, which is no way to make a living, best I can tell.
Well, I've always had this radical idea that companies should create products and services that they sell to customers who pay them for it. And it turns out that people will pay for value. You know, you create good value, people will pay. I mean, look at in the publishing industry, something like The Economist, which is this ugly little magazine, and it doesn't have much of a web presence, but it's doing just great, and people will pay for it. On the other hand, in the publishing industry, this is a whole separate conversation, there are a whole number of business models that are workable. And at the other extreme, you've got The Guardian. It's basically giving everything away, but it's generating massive advertising revenue and is doing quite well. The Guardian is a huge juggernaut now in the global news world, and it wasn't so much before.
Let me do a follow-up on Capitalism 2.0. How much do companies truly use social media to interact with their customers?
Well, that's one area where companies are quite active. And it's not just you go onto Twitter and you tweet about your company, or you respond to someone who says, I don't like my washing machine. But companies are starting to move away from the old industrial model of marketing, which is I tell you something, you're a passive recipient. So mass media, mass advertising, etc. Now companies, especially the smart ones, are reaching out to engage customers more. So in some cases, turning their customers into co-producers of their products and services. So you've got companies like Threadless, a clothing company where the customers design the products. You've got companies like Doritos that got their customers to create their advertising for the Super Bowl. the Doritos Crash the Super Bowl contest. And so those ads are terrific. They're created by Doritos customers. But overall, I would say that the basic model of the industrial age corporation, this vertically integrated, command and control, hierarchical, fairly insulated thing that pushes out stuff, is still pretty much intact. Now that's all about to change because of some big developments with the next generation internet. But for now, the impact has been partial, I would say.
Well, I promised earlier we'd come back to travel because you mentioned that a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
So let's look at that. One sector in particular, hotels. If you think about where the hotel business was 20 years ago when you wrote the first edition of this, and you think about the disruptive influence the internet has had on the hotel business 20 years later, what are you seeing?
Well, the hotels have lost huge power to the what are called the OTAs, the online travel agents. So if you're going to go to Cancun or something, chances are you're not going to go to the whatever hotel and see if they have a space. You're going to go to some intermediary, a new intermediary that's been created. And these intermediaries control the industry. They place all kinds of demands on the hotels. But that's all about to change too. There are really very interesting new companies. One is called Demure. It's actually based in Waterloo, Ontario. And they're creating a meta marketplace, they call it, for all the hotels. So they can create their own online market and get the control back from the travel agents. But these are typical disruptive battles that are underway in every industry.
Which governments around the world, in your view, have truly embraced the digital economy, particularly as it relates to providing public services?
Well, this is another area where I worried, will governments actually be able to embrace this? And overall, governments are really paving the cow path. They're taking these services that they have and they're making them online. Well, this is not very helpful because we have these big old industrial age government bureaucracies that need to change. Now, there are good examples of changes to the delivery of services, and there are good examples to the nature of governance itself, that is the nature of democracy. But on the first one, because what you asked, one of the biggest trends is something called open data. And this is not about transparency. It's not freedom of information or anything. It's governments have thousands of categories of data, raw data. And the idea is that you just publish this data and you create what's called a platform whereby private companies, civil society, NGOs, foundations, other government agencies, individuals, academics self-organize to create the value. So something like, I don't know, the BC Apps for Climate Change. They conducted a challenge where they said, we're going to release all the data that we have about carbon, and we challenge you, citizens of the world, to use this data to create apps. So they got a whole bunch of fabulous apps. The prize was $25,000. It wasn't even created by it wasn't given by a government. A private company gave the prize. So this cost the government nothing. And they got all these awesome apps. One of the ones that I saw, you could look at your mobile device and see how much carbon your company is emitting. And you turn off the lights in an office building and the carbon goes down. So
it gives you useful information that you can actually use to change your behavior to improve the world.
Exactly. And bigger picture, what it's giving you is a government service that costs the government nothing. So this is not about, automating government processes. This is the potential to re-architect what is government and to change the division of labor in society about how we create public value. We can have better government and it can cost less. This whole phony dichotomy that we have to slash government because it costs too much, is not workable because the irresistible pressures to reduce the cost of government are meeting up with the immovable object of public expectations regarding what government should be.
I hear you, but all of this, I presume, requires forward-thinking people to be in politics, in the bureaucracy, challenging the status quo. Do you see evidence of that?
It happens, but it's rare. And typically it doesn't come from the top. You know, typically it comes from some change agent, often a younger person within a government organization. And as for politicians, there's an emergent crisis of legitimacy of our democratic institutions. I'll just tell you an amazing story. I haven't really told this publicly before, but I was at Davos last year, and everybody says, "What's your Davos moment?" I'm on a panel on citizen.
This is just tell everybody. This is in Switzerland, where
yeah,
lots of
the 2,500 people that run the world go there.
Show up to Davos.
Yeah, and so I'm on a panel about citizen engagement. And I'm saying, I think we have a crisis of legitimacy. Voting in our OECD countries, the biggest countries in the world, is declining, especially among young people. More and more young people agree with the bumper sticker, "Don't vote." It only encourages them. And then you look at the U.S. Congress, or not to get into Canadian politics, but you know, people like Rob Ford in Toronto, where people wonder not just what's wrong with Rob Ford, but maybe City Hall is like irrelevant because it's a big gong show. Well, so I said, if we don't fix this, we're going to end up with a social explosion that's going to make the 60s look like kid stuff. I get stopped by this young guy on the panel. He's like 28 years old. He created a network called a VOZ, 34 million young people who are active in trying to bring about change. He says to me, "Well, Don, I don't get your point. I mean, why is it a crisis if all around the world young people think that our fossilized institutions of democracy are bankrupt?" And I'm like, you could have knocked me over with a feather like Bob Dylan. You don't know what's going on here. There's something going on, but you don't know what it is. Now, he's wrong, of course. We need representative democracy. But that was just a beautiful little vignette to me about how we need to step up and change these institutions. The internet is the new platform to do this.
But his life seems to thrive without it.
It does. Yeah. And what happens if those 34 million people decide we're going to take another route to bring about change, then, which is basically what they're doing now.
You are the Chancellor of Trent University, so I want to finish off here on work and learning, because in the book you talk to us about the fact that work and learning are increasingly becoming the same thing. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's called knowledge work. What are you and I doing right now? Are we working or are we learning? You know, it's the same activity. Shoshana Zuboff at Harvard makes this point. She says you're sitting there in your cubicle and you got your feet up on the desk and your head back and you see your boss coming down the aisle. What's the first thing you do? You know, you try and get your feet off the desk and look like you're working. She says, well, feet up, head back may be a pretty good position for working in a knowledge economy, because maybe you're thinking about something. So, and furthermore, learning is something that happens lifelong. When I graduated, I was kind of set for life, and today these kids graduating from Trent, they're set for 15 minutes, you know, and half of what they took in the first year, if it's a technical course, is obsolete by the time they get to the fourth year. So we need to be learning lifelong. And one of the things I argue in the new edition of the digital economy is that maybe this has some really big implications for our training strategies. If work and learning are roughly the same thing, maybe rather than sending people off to separate training, we ought to find ways to integrate these two better. Maybe we try and increase the learning component of work. So at my company, our training department is 3 words: everybody must blog.
Everybody must blog because?
Yeah, because that increases the learning component of work. You got to do research, you got to write well, you got to craft your ideas, you got to collaborate with others, you got to be able to defend your point of view, you got to make things popular, you got to engage people.
And then share it with the world.
Yeah, and that is helping you learn, basically, while you're doing the work.
This is a bit of a, well, I thought it might be a bit of a downer question to end on, given your position at Trent University, but maybe not. Do colleges and universities have still the central place in that work-learning environment that you just discussed that they once did?
Well, again, we have industrial age colleges and universities like every other institution. The industrial age was an age of scale and standardization, where something at the top pushed out standard units to passive recipients. They push out products, TV shows, advertising, services, government services. They push out lectures. And the lecture is the basic model of pedagogy, and it was quite appropriate for the 15th century. But today, there are much better ways. So we need to reinvent our colleges and universities. I don't think they become less important, though. Even the physical place is enormously important. I mean, Marvin Dressler is the head of sociology at Princeton on a panel a while ago. We were talking about this. He says, Don, the university is a great place for young people to go for 4 years and get older. And he says, and they're bound to learn something while they're there. So, you know, in the transition from the agrarian to the industrial age, we figured out some stuff. Example, we figured out that we needed to have a literate workforce. So we created public education. What's the equivalent today? It's not to cut back on higher education, it's to increase it. I think for many young people, a single college degree or university degree will just be a first step in their lifelong learning, and some of it will be formal.
That is just one of a couple of dozen of really fascinating chapters you've got in here. The Digital Economy, Rethinking Promise and Peril in the Age of Networked Intelligence. Don Tapscott, you always give us a hell of a lot to think about. Thanks for coming in to TVO tonight.
My pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.